Okay, hi there. So, in this video, I'm going to talk about your first step to improve your bladder function. And I'm just going to take a second and remind you that this content is informational only and it is not medical advice. I'm also assuming that you're up to date on your medical care and screening. And this is important because there are so many medical conditions that can impact the bladder. So, for example, diabetes can impact how your bladder works. Pregnancy can impact the bladder. I've even seen women who had an early cancer, and the symptom that brought them to see the doctor was leaking. So, it is important to make sure that you are healthy, not pregnant, and up to date with your medical care. And those are assumptions that I'm making in this video. So, your first step is to determine why you are leaking. You need to know your diagnosis. Not everyone realizes this, but women leak for different reasons. And there are four main types of leaking in women. So, the first is stress urinary incontinence. The second is urgency urinary incontinence. The third is mixed urinary incontinence. And the last is overflow urinary incontinence. Each diagnosis is treated differently, and so it makes having that correct diagnosis really important. So, stress urinary incontinence is when an activity generates a pressure in your abdominal cavity and that forces the urine out. So, women that have this type of leaking have leaking with coughing, sneezing, laughing, exercise. This is the kind of leaking that women who run and women who jump in activities like CrossFit and volleyball get. Urgency urinary incontinence is also called overactive bladder or OAB. This is when your bladder muscle contracts and forces the urine out at a time that is undesirable. So, your bladder should only contract when you are sitting on the toilet and your brain tells your bladder to start contracting and squeezing the urine out. And in overactive bladder, this happens at other times, at embarrassing times, at times when you're not ready. Women that have this type of leaking feel like they have to go all of the time, or they feel like they have to run to the bathroom and they're not going to make it. And sometimes they leak before they actually get there. Mixed urinary incontinence is when you have stress incontinence as well as urgency urinary incontinence or overactive bladder. And it may not seem fair, but you can absolutely leak for two different reasons. When you have this type of leakage, we usually treat one leakage type first. So let's say the stress incontinence. You have to know you're still going to have those overactive bladder symptoms. And then when we've treated that, we'll move on to treat the second form. And usually we start with the type of leaking that is the most bothersome to you. And then overflow incontinence happens when you empty poorly. Your bladder is always full, and some of it just overflows and kind of leaks out. And the symptoms here are usually kind of all over the place. It doesn't feel like it follows a pattern. You just leak at random times. So you might need a visual at this point in time. And I put together this little video for my website to help explain the different types of leaking. So let's watch that real quick just to go over these points again.
Bladder leaking is common and impacts nearly half of all women. But what goes wrong, and why does this happen? Let's look at how things are supposed to function. Your bladder has two jobs: storing and emptying urine. When it is storing, the urethral muscle contracts and squeezes closed while the bladder muscles relax. When it is emptying, the sphincter muscle relaxes and the bladder muscle squeezes and pushes the urine out. There are different ways that this delicate system can break down and cause women to leak. Some women leak because the urethral sphincter can't squeeze tightly enough to hold urine in during an activity, like jumping, laughing, running, or sneezing. This is called stress urinary incontinence. Some women leak because the bladder muscles contracts and pushes urine out when you aren't ready. This is called urgency incontinence or overactive bladder. Other women empty poorly, usually because the bladder doesn't contract well. The bladder is always full, and this results in random leaking. You can also leak for more than one reason. Figuring out what isn't functioning properly is the key to fixing your leaking.
So, this leads us to making the diagnosis. So, with urinary incontinence, we usually make the diagnosis based on symptoms. I can usually tell what type of leaking you have just by talking to you and hearing your story. You may know exactly what type of leakage you have, and the previous information may help you make your diagnosis. But if you need help, there are also questionnaires that you can use. And these questionnaires are designed to be used by women at home. They don't need to be done in the doctor's office. And I have one on my website that's called the Quid. So if you go to thewomensbladder.com, you can click on that and use that to make your diagnosis. So the next three videos all focus on treatments. The first talks about general things that can help bladder function. The next talks about treatments for stress urinary incontinence. And then the third talks about treatments for urgency urinary incontinence. I haven't included a video on treatments for overflow urinary incontinence because those women really need to be seen by a specialist. Remember that you can have mixed urinary incontinence, which means that you have both stress and urgency urinary incontinence. So then all of the videos will be relevant for you. Okay, let's go ahead and get started on those.